There was just one decisive game here today in the Biel Grandmasters tournament, but it has quite an effect on the top of the table standings. So let's have a look at the game Alexander Moiseenko against Maxime Vachier-Lagrave. Moiseenko with the white pieces, and Vachier-Lagrave played his favourite Grunfeld, and it seemed that Moiseenko was very well prepared indeed. He actually played or repeated a line that Vachier-Lagrave has played in the past with this move Queen A4 check, a tricky move. However, black blocks this check, then it causes him slight problems. So for example, if he plays bishop d7, then the queen can come back here and white gains a tempo here, and maybe the bishop doesn't want to be on d7. Or if knight d7, well, very often the knight in the Grunfeld wants to come to c6 to attack the pawn on d4, so maybe it's not so well placed on d7. So black plays queen d7, and the queen just comes back, and there's pretty standard development now. White supports his centre, and black, in traditional Grunfeld style, attacks the centre with c5. But of course, with the queen on d7, then the bishop has been forced to go to the long diagonal instead of coming to g4. So that's another little nuance in the position, and why it's maybe slightly unfavourable to block with queen d7, or it's just different anyway. But black's position seems absolutely acceptable at this point in the game. It has the traditional counterplay against white's centre. But it's here that Moiseenko varied from this previous game of Vachier-Lagrave's. Previously, Austrian player Markus Rager played rook a d1 here. And, well, after this, Vachier-Lagrave had a satisfactory position. There was enough play against the pawn on d4. Today, Moiseenko had prepared bishop b5. In fact, after the game, Moiseenko very generously gave the credit for this move to his second here, Alexander Zubarev, which was very nice of him, who'd been working on this variation. So there's a pin, there's a threat to push with d5, and Vachier-Lagrave counters this straight away with a6. And now we see the point. The bishop drops back to e2, and this little maneuver has sort of created little weakness with the pawn on b6, which advances. Now it seems as though black has made some progress here, but actually, as we'll see, it means that life is a little bit more uncomfortable for that bishop on b7, as it's now slightly restricted. But also, it becomes possible for white to attack these pawns with a4. So this is the point of tempting these pawns forward. But first of all, there's some kind of threat here. So d5. And Vachier-Lagrave played knight e5. It's very interesting to see what happens if knight a5. Of course, this involves a sacrifice, where we saw a similar sacrifice yesterday in Richard Rapport's game against Ding Liren. It's a pure exchange sacrifice, but of course the dark squares around the king are very weak. I mean, actually this kind of sacrifice is seen very often in the Grunfeld, and here white gets absolutely typical compensation. This bishop on b7 is very poor, and you can see here very plainly what I mean when I say that this pawn restricts the bishop, because that bishop is running short of squares, and if it's defended with this rook, then bishop a7 wins material. Excuse me a second. And if the bishop is defended with the other rook, then bishop f4 wins material. Otherwise, well, the bishop has to drop back, but of course this is very passive. And you can see that this bishop has very nice options to attack on these dart squared. Meanwhile, that pawn on d5 is powerful, locks out black's pieces. And white is very well coordinated. Don't forget, there's also the chance for white's knight to invade on c6 via one of these squares. So this is a very promising exchange sacrifice, actually. So I can understand why Vachier-Lagrave wished to avoid that, but instead he played knight e5. Moiseenko said after the game that now he was starting to feel very confident, actually, because he secured his centre. When white has these wonderful pawns in the Grundfeld, it's very important that black is somehow able to hit out at them, but here that's just not possible. If the knight comes to g4, well, of course we exchange that off, and then we can see white's strategic idea here is to play a4 and to get a position where there's one isolated pawn here, and this bishop is still very vulnerable. You know, we want to hit it with rook b4 or maybe rook b1, and if that pawn advances, then, well, that becomes weaker. So this is a pleasant position for white. In the game, Vachier-Lagrave played rook c8 and a4 anyway to isolate a pawn, and the Frenchman tried to play more actively. And this might not be bad, this is still playable. Moiseenko exchanged and then took on a8. And here black recaptured with the rook, but it might have been better to recapture with the bishop. But this is a tricky position. For example, white has a choice of whether to go for this endgame, like this. He's still a pawn up, and you try to restrict this bishop, or whether to play this position. Again, white is a pawn up, but probably this is what black should do, because in retaining this bishop, this gives black better defensive chances. But instead, Vachier-Lagrave took with the rook, and now this is an unpleasant position for black to play. White is a clear pawn up, and once again it's not easy to bring that bishop into the game. By the way, if bishop a6, white has a choice between queen a2 or rook a1. Rook a1 is the best, probably, with this very standard tactic and mating on the back flank. Of course, black doesn't have to take the queen. So rook c8, and the queen came back, and this is a very difficult position for black indeed, if you can't break down these pawns. Vachier-Lagrave now took a very committal decision. Well, he wanted to break down those pawns, and the only way he could think of doing this was to exchange off his fantastic bishop on g7, and in practical terms this is now extremely difficult for black. I can understand why he wanted to do that, to try and simplify the position, but now white has a very pleasant choice of how he goes about attacking the king on these weakened squares. You could play queen d2, trying to swing across to the dark squares. Moiseenko selected bishop a1, and this proves to be a very sound, practical choice. And after queen b2, that forces the pawn forward, and he just played the pawn to f3. And again, this locks out the bishop on b7. So that's just not playing, and continues to be rather vulnerable, actually. And the problem is that this pawn on d4 is going to be captured at some point. Of course, if this is taken and if black can exchange queens, then he has very good drawing chances with the opposite colour bishops. But what white tries to do is to take with the bishop, and that will retain all his attacking chances if the queens and the rooks are still on the board. So let's see what happened. And here we go. White is just building up and wants to take with the bishop, and after the queen, say, comes back here and the rook moves away, then white has tremendous attacking chances. So Vachier-Lagrave attempted to complicate with f5, but of course this is highly risky because it leaves his king exposed. By the way, if rook takes pawn, this would be a mistake. It seems as though white is attacking. In fact, after this move, he has very good drawing chances. After the check, the king just comes back here, or possibly even to e6 actually, and black is fine. But Moiseenko took on f5. Well, this involves some careful calculation, but in fact the Ukrainian had it all worked out. The tricky variation is bishop takes f3. And now this was an impressive piece of calculation. If this is played, this wasn't played. In fact, white's king can escape. Let's take a look. King comes up. Okay, black's piece down. He has to keep checking the king. And now, with careful footwork, white's king can escape. Seems like it's just going round in circles. In fact, after queen g5, then king f1 and the king escapes. Or if queen c2, then king g3 and again no more checks. And if this is taken, then we take the rook and white is a piece up. You take here next. Now that was actually an incredibly important variation, and I think white has to calculate exactly, but that takes time. And actually Moiseenko was running a little bit short of time here, but that was time well spent, because after taking, it does mean that black's king is exposed. It would be very easy to play a safer move here, but you would perhaps risk throwing away the win. But this is a strong move. Of course, black can just recapture this, but in this position, the opposite colour bishops mean that white's attack is very, very strong, and the king eventually will be cut down. So in the game, this was tried, but white should be winning this position now. And after this, queen g3 is a very nice move. This makes a very solid impression because it keeps the king safe, it keeps attacking, and so this is threatened. Rook e1 is also threatened. And of course white eventually wants to take on d4. This bishop is waiting in the wings. So this was the game continuation. Queen f2, again, rock solid. So white wants to tempt this pawn forward, and then the queen will switch across, and it'll be mate down here. Now white just has to be very careful here. And you could go on the attack straight away, but I really like this move, h3 first, making sure that the king, well, in some variations, will have a nice bolt hole, and basically white doesn't need to rush actually. If d3, this will open up this diagonal, and now queen h4 wins, and queen h8, and the king is not going to escape while the rook is here. By the way, when I was looking at this after the game with Moiseenko, I said, well, obviously, white will be winning after queen b2, and of course I fell into a trap in the position. Black will probably draw after this move. For example, after takes here, and the trick is d2, and black gets queen, and although white is 2 pawns up with opposite colour bishops, actually, well, I think black has very good drawing chances. But after h3, h3, well, black didn't play d3 anyway, it went queen f4, rook e4, now the rook is spinning into the attack. Actually, they just repeated moves. As I said, Moiseenko was running a little bit short of time, but now he found bishop b2 with the idea rook e4 and then taking on d4, or possibly even swinging across here. And black is lost here. Vachier-Lagrave played d3, but after queen b6, that really is decisive, as the queen hits the bishop, the rook, and the pawn on g6, and that really is too much for black to bear. I think that game showed Alexander Moiseenko's style very well indeed. Positionally sound, and with a very good grasp of the strategic concepts in a position. So after that brings the Ukrainian back into contention for first prize. The other 2 games were drawn, which means that Dingliren is still in the lead with 14 points. Etienne Bacrot and Alexander Moiseenko on 13 points. Maxime Vachier-Lagrave on 11. It's actually possible that 4 players can share first tomorrow if the results go right. But in any case, it's very tight at the top, and it should be a fascinating last round tomorrow.